I want to start with some personal news. I will be leaving CNN in April. Let me back up. After most of my 20s working my way up in local news, I came to this network in 2008.
When the state of Florida first stood up in front of cameras and announced that it was going to fight one of the worst invasive species disasters in American history by hiring ordinary people to walk into the swamp and hunt snakes by hand, a lot of people laughed. Late-night hosts made jokes about it. Wildlife commentators online called it a publicity stunt. The idea sounded almost too simple to work. A handful of hunters, armed with flashlights and bags, going up against a population of snakes that some scientists believe could number in the tens of thousands, spread across thousands of square miles of some of the most impenetrable wetland terrain on the continent. It sounded like sending a few people with butterfly nets to stop a flood. But what actually happened over the following years turned that punchline into one of the more surprising conservation stories in recent memory, and it did not stop with human hunters. It eventually pulled in an army of much smaller, much stranger creatures that nobody planned on. And the way that story unfolded is stranger than most people realize. To understand why anyone laughed in the first place, you have to understand how bad the problem actually was. Burmese pythons are not native to North America. They come from Southeast Asia, and they ended up in the Florida Everglades through the exotic pet trade, most likely through a combination of accidental escapes and deliberate releases by owners who no longer wanted to care for a snake that had outgrown their living room. A python bought as a 2-foot hatchling can grow into an animal stretching well past 10 feet and weighing over 100 pounds within a few years, and plenty of people who bought one as a novelty were not prepared for that reality. Some of those snakes got loose during storms, including the chaos of Hurricane Andrew in 1992, when a breeding facility near Miami was destroyed and an unknown number of pythons escaped into the wild. Others were simply let go in canals and marshes by owners who ran out of options. Once they were in the Everglades, the pythons found something close to paradise. The climate matched their native range closely enough that they had no trouble surviving winters. The wetlands were full of prey animals that had never evolved any instinct to recognize a giant ambush predator, because nothing like it had existed in North America for millions of years. And crucially, the pythons had no natural predators of their own in this new environment. Alligators can occasionally kill a python, and pythons can occasionally kill an alligator, but there was nothing systematically hunting them the way predators keep prey populations in check in a balanced ecosystem. The result was a population explosion. Researchers who began tracking the decline of native mammals in python territory found staggering numbers: raccoon populations down by the vast majority, opossum sightings collapsing, marsh rabbits nearly vanishing from large stretches of the park, bobcat sightings dropping sharply. In some of the hardest-hit survey areas, it became difficult to find any mid-sized native mammal at all. A road that used to be littered with raccoon and rabbit tracks every night would show almost nothing. This is the part that made the joke land so easily when Florida first announced its hunting program. Wildlife officials openly admitted they did not know exactly how many pythons were out there. Estimates ranged from the low tens of thousands to numbers so large that nobody wanted to put an official figure on it, because the terrain made an accurate census almost impossible. Pythons are extraordinary at hiding. Their skin pattern breaks up their outline against sawgrass and shadows so effectively that even experienced hunters can walk within a few feet of a resting snake and never see it. They spend enormous amounts of time submerged or tucked into burrows. They are most active at night, and the Everglades themselves are a maze of flooded prairie, dense hammocks, and canals that stretch for thousands of square miles, much of it barely accessible on foot. Against that backdrop, the idea of solving the problem by paying people an hourly wage plus a bonus per snake sounded, to a lot of observers, like political theater rather than actual policy. The skepticism only deepened when the state tried a different approach, opening the hunt up to the public. Florida Fish and Wildlife launched an annual event that came to be known as the Python Challenge, inviting ordinary residents and out-of-state thrill-seekers alike to register, get a crash course in humane capture and euthanasia, and head into the wetlands for a chance at prize money. More than 1,000 people signed up for one of the earliest competitions, and by the time the month-long hunt wrapped up, only a few dozen snakes had actually been caught. Critics pounced on that gap immediately. If over 1,000 motivated people with a cash incentive could only find a few dozen snakes in an entire month, how exactly was this supposed to put a dent in a population some scientists guessed might be over 100,000 strong? Wildlife officials themselves were candid about it, explaining that eradicating the species from the Everglades was never realistically the goal of these public hunts. The real value, they said, was awareness, data collection, and giving researchers a rough sense of python behavior and habitat use that they could feed into the more targeted, professionally staffed programs running alongside it. That distinction did not stop the punchlines. To a lot of people watching from a distance, a public contest that pulled in a few dozen snakes against a population that size looked like exactly the kind of toothless government gesture people expect when a problem feels too big to actually solve. And yet the program did something that surprised almost everyone who mocked it. It kept going, it kept improving, and it kept producing results that added up. The South Florida Water Management District's python removal initiative started small, with a limited number of contracted hunters covering public lands, but it expanded steadily. The state hired a select team of hunters to deal with the infestation, and the program that began in March 2017 had reached its 1,000th python capture within a little over a year. One of the program's most successful hunters, a man who became something of a local celebrity for his catch numbers, described the physical and psychological toll of the work candidly. He talked about approaching the task with mixed feelings, describing the process of humanely putting down a captured python as something he had to make peace with over time, framing the animal itself as beautiful and not at fault for where it ended up, even as he understood the necessity of removing it from an ecosystem it was tearing apart. The numbers kept climbing well beyond that first 1,000, and the professional side of the program looked very different from the awareness-driven public contests. Wildlife managers eventually began describing the removal effort in terms of tonnage rather than individual snake counts, because at a certain point counting heads stopped capturing the real scale of what was happening. Conservation groups working specific stretches of southwest Florida reported removing tons of python biomass over the following years. The Conservancy of Southwest Florida reported capturing and humanely killing 20 tons of python since 2013, including a record 6,300 pounds during a single recent breeding season. To put that scale in perspective, 20 tons is roughly the weight of a fully loaded city bus, entirely made up of a single invasive species pulled out of the wetlands by hand. Officials involved in that program did the grim math on what that tonnage actually represented in terms of native wildlife consumed to produce it, a reminder that every pound of python removed was, in effect, a pound of raccoons, rabbits, birds, and other native animals that would not be eaten going forward. Necropsies on captured pythons routinely turned up an unsettling inventory of what had been swallowed: muskrats, deer, wild boar, threatened wading birds, bobcats, dozens of alligators, and even the occasional family pet that had wandered too close to the water's edge. And still, that number came from only a relatively small slice of the affected area. Those pythons came from a roughly 200 square mile section of southwestern Florida, while the greater Everglades ecosystem where the snakes continue to thrive covers more than 7,800 square miles, with wildlife biologists estimating tens of thousands of pythons still roaming the broader region. So even after years of sustained effort, hunters were still only scratching the surface of the total population. That is the uncomfortable truth behind the mockery. The skeptics were not entirely wrong about the scale of the problem. Human hunters alone were never going to eliminate pythons from the Everglades. But they were never the whole plan, even if most people assumed they were, and the state began offering monthly bonuses and expanding the program into additional counties precisely because the early results, however incomplete, were promising enough to justify scaling up rather than shutting down. Florida also leaned on technology and biology to widen the search beyond what human eyes could manage. Wildlife officials began using radio telemetry to track a small number of captured male pythons, fitting them with transmitters and releasing them back into the wild during breeding season. Because pythons are drawn to potential mates through scent trails, these tagged males would often lead researchers directly to large breeding females hiding in dense vegetation that would have been essentially invisible otherwise. A single tagged male could effectively act as a guide, walking hunters straight to snakes they never would have found on their own. Detection dogs were brought in as well, trained specifically to pick up the scent of python skin and feces in terrain where visual searching was nearly useless. These efforts multiplied the effectiveness of the human hunters without needing to multiply the number of people wading through the swamp. But the part of this story that genuinely stunned researchers, and the part that connects most directly to the idea of thousands of creatures doing work nobody planned for, came from somewhere nobody had engineered at all. It came from a parasite, Scientists studying native Florida snakes began noticing something disturbing in the early 2010s. An Asian parasite called Raelietiella orientalis had found its way, through the invasive Burmese python, into Florida's native snake species, and researchers first documented it after finding the parasites in a dead pygmy rattlesnake they had been studying. This long, whitish, worm-like parasite feeds on a snake's lungs until the infected animal dies, and it was first identified in a native snake in southern Florida before researchers traced its origin back to the invasive Burmese python. The parasite is technically a pentastome, a strange lineage of creature more closely related to crustaceans than to true worms, and it almost certainly hitched a ride into the state inside the lungs of pythons imported through the exotic pet trade decades earlier. The discovery itself came in a genuinely unsettling way. A graduate student tracking pygmy rattlesnakes in central Florida found one of her study animals dead in the field, and when she looked closer, pale worm-like parasites were visibly crawling out of the dead snake's mouth. That image, more than any spreadsheet of infection rates, is what first pushed the discovery beyond a footnote in an academic paper and into something researchers felt obligated to investigate seriously. What made the finding especially alarming was location. The dead rattlesnake was found roughly 100 miles north of where Burmese pythons were considered established, meaning the parasite had already outrun the predator that brought it into the state in the first place. It was not staying contained to the swampy core of python territory the way a hitchhiking parasite might be expected to. It was moving on its own, through native snake populations that had never been anywhere near a python. Researchers were quick to point out that this was not a brand-new organism suddenly mutating into something dangerous. Raelietiella orientalis had existed in Asian snake populations for a very long time, doing exactly what pentastome parasites do in ecosystems where their hosts evolved alongside them, causing manageable, low-level infections that rarely killed an adult animal outright. The danger in Florida came entirely from the mismatch between parasite and host, the same kind of mismatch that made the pythons themselves so devastating to unprepared native prey species in the first place. The mechanism by which it spreads is genuinely unsettling, and it explains why it managed to become an invasion within an invasion. The life cycle begins when a cockroach eats the feces of an already infected snake, and the parasite's eggs hatch into larvae inside that cockroach. Small mammals, lizards, or amphibians that eat the infected roach pick up the larvae next. And when a snake eventually eats one of those infected animals, the parasite completes its journey into a new reptile host, immediately migrating toward the lungs to begin feeding and reproducing. Once established, it causes severe organ damage as it feeds on the snake's blood inside the lungs, and researchers found that it had already spread to affect 18 of Florida's 4 to 6 native snake species, including the dusky pygmy rattlesnake and the cottonmouth. Burmese pythons, having evolved alongside this parasite for a very long time in their native range, can tolerate infections that are frequently lethal to species that never developed any defense against it. Because native Florida snakes have no built-in resistance, they are far more vulnerable to an infection that pythons themselves can often shrug off. Smaller native species suffer the worst. Species like the dusky pygmy rattlesnake, which only grow to somewhere between 15 and 24 inches long, have such small lungs that the parasite overwhelms their limited respiratory capacity far more easily than it does the massive lung structure of a 10-foot python. Field researchers documented cases where infected snakes were found flipped onto their backs, belly up, dying with the pale, thread-like parasite visibly protruding from their mouths, a genuinely disturbing sight for anyone who witnessed it firsthand. This is the twist that most people never expected when the python crisis first made headlines. It was not simply a story about one invasive predator hunting native prey to the brink of collapse. It became a story about an invisible hitchhiker riding along with that predator, spreading sickness through the reptile community in a completely different and much harder to track way. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange, and where the framing of thousands of tiny creatures being unleashed almost accidentally starts to make sense. This parasite was never deliberately introduced by any agency as a weapon against pythons. Nobody planned it, nobody approved it, and nobody controlled where it went once it arrived. It slipped into the state along with the exact animal it now sometimes weakens, and it has continued to spread on its own momentum ever since, moving north well beyond the original range of the python population that carried it in. Research out of the University of Florida found that pythons had spread the parasite to native snakes, and those native snakes were now spreading it among themselves independently, meaning the infection no longer needed pythons at all to keep moving through the ecosystem. Researchers monitoring its spread describe it advancing steadily, and comparisons have even been drawn to how quickly a contagious disease can move once it establishes itself in a population with no immunity. This lungworm has already been documented in dozens of counties, spreading well beyond the borders of where pythons themselves are established, carried entirely by the native snakes that caught it from them. For pythons, the parasite represents a genuine, if partial, natural check on a population that has otherwise had none. It does not eliminate pythons the way python hunters occasionally eliminate individual snakes, and it is not a tidy, controllable solution the way a planned biological control program would be. But researchers studying python health have found that heavy parasite loads can affect a python's respiratory function, its overall condition, and potentially its reproductive success, meaning that this uninvited hitchhiker is quietly doing something that no team of human hunters, no matter how many were hired, could ever fully replicate. Working inside the snake population itself, spreading independently, entirely self-sustaining, without needing a budget, a truck, or a paycheck. In a strange and uncomfortable way, it is functioning as exactly the kind of population check that Everglades ecosystems lost when Burmese pythons arrived with no natural predator at all. The catch, and the reason researchers are far from celebrating this as some kind of natural solution, is that the parasite does not discriminate the way a targeted program would. It is currently doing more damage to Florida's own native snakes than it appears to be doing to the pythons that brought it here in the first place. Scientists studying the outbreak have pointed out that when an animal is exposed to a pathogen it never evolved alongside, the consequences can be severe, and that is exactly the situation many of Florida's native snake species now find themselves in. A rat snake, a water snake, a rattlesnake that has lived in Florida's ecosystems for thousands of years has no more resistance to this Asian parasite than the raccoons and rabbits had resistance to the pythons themselves. So while pythons absorb some level of harm from carrying and spreading the infection, the species paying the highest price are frequently the very native animals conservationists are trying to protect in the first place. It is not a clean hero versus villain story.